So when we think of faith, we often think about action. We think of Moses parting the Red Sea. We think of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego standing up to a king and facing a fiery furnace. We think about David slaying Goliath or Joshua marching around the walls of Jericho until they fall down. Even in modern times, when someone leaves their job for the unknown, we consider it a leap of faith. Everyone's heard that, taking a leap of faith. We want to always associate faith with some kind of action. We admire the faith that moves mountains, but there's another kind of faith, one that's often much harder to walk in when we're challenged. It's much quieter, it's vastly underrated. The faith of submission. Today we're going to look at a story in the Bible and see how it demonstrates the faith to act and the faith to submit. So let's look at the story of Abraham in the Bible. His relationship with God is defined by the words he hears: go, leave, walk, build, sacrifice. When God says go, Abraham doesn't ask for a map. He doesn't ask for a destination. Just imagine that. I couldn't think of getting in my car and driving somewhere and having no clue where I'm going. Honestly, in today's world, the first thing we do is pull up our maps because we want to check the traffic. We want to see if there's a different route. What's the fastest way to get us where we're going? But Abraham doesn't do that. He just starts walking. The Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you." So Abram went as the Lord has told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. So later in Abraham's life, when God asks for Isaac, Abraham doesn't debate God's promises because God had already promised that Isaac would be the father of many nations. "This is my covenant with you. You will be the father of many nations. No longer will you be called Abram. Your name will be Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations." And God confirms this covenant will be fulfilled in Isaac a few verses later when he says, "Your wife will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him." So when God calls Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, he trusted and had faith that ultimately God's plan would be fulfilled. He just had to act in it. So he wakes up early and chops wood. So let's contrast Abraham's faith to act with Isaac's faith to submit, and how Isaac's silence in this moment echoes what will be the greatest moment in human history. First, let's get rid of the Sunday school myth that all of you have in your heads right now about Abraham sacrificing Isaac. Isaac wasn't a helpless toddler. He wasn't a young child who wasn't aware of what was going on at this point. Most scholars actually estimate that Isaac was a strong young man, anywhere from 15 to his 30s. Abraham was over 100 years old at this point, tired, frail, exhausted towards the end of his life. So Isaac even carried the wood up the mountain himself. He looks around as they're climbing Mount Moriah and asks, "The fire and wood are here, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham replies, "God himself will provide the lamb, my son." Now, at some point at the top of the mountain, as Abraham begins building the stone altar for this sacrifice, Isaac has to connect the dots. He knows at this point that he's the lamb. Isaac could have easily ran away. He could have overpowered his dad. After all, he's much younger, he's much stronger, he's faster. Instead, the text gives us total silence from Isaac at this moment. He allows himself to be tied up and bound. The story in Genesis 22 is actually called the Akedah in Jewish tradition, which translates to the binding. To the original readers in the ancient world, a God demanding a child sacrifice wasn't shocking. Surrounding nations did it all the time to fake gods like Molech. The real shock of this story comes from two things. First, the restraint of God. Yahweh stops the sacrifice, draws a distinct line in the sand, and separates himself permanently from the bloodthirsty idols of the ancient world. Secondly, you see the restraint of Isaac. In the Jewish commentary, the Midrash, Isaac is viewed not as a victim in this situation, but as a hero. There's actually Jewish tradition that Isaac actually asked Abraham to bind him tightly so that he wouldn't flinch out of a natural instinct and disqualify the sacrifice to God. Isaac represents the faith of submission. It takes great strength to restrain power. Isaac's faith wasn't weakness, it was a conscious, strong choice to trust the promise given to his father, even if it cost him his life. But we know that God stops Abraham right at the peak and says, "Do not lay a hand on the boy. Do not do anything to him. Now I know you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." But 2,000 years later, on that same mountain range, God the Father doesn't stop the sacrifice. He doesn't withhold his son. Jesus, the one that the story of Isaac is foreshadowing, submits perfectly to the Father's will. When Jesus was in the garden before his arrest, he says, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." This wasn't Jesus giving in to defeat. It was a conscious, painful decision to align his human will with the divine plan of his Father. Jesus did not go to the cross because he was trapped by Roman soldiers or betrayed by the religious leaders. He went because he chose to submit to God the Father. And at Calvary, that submission was fully realized. He remained silent before his accusers, refusing to call down legions of angels to save him. Hanging between heaven and earth, bearing the weight of humanity's brokenness. His final words were not a cry of defeat, but the ultimate declaration of complete obedience. "It is finished. And Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." Paul writes it this way: "He made nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross." Did you know that same mountain, Mount Moriah, where Isaac submitted to the will of his father, is believed to be the same mountain, Calvary, where Jesus submitted to the will of the Father? In fact, the location isn't the only similarity in these stories. The parallels are staggering when you look at them. Isaac was the only begotten son of the promise, and Jesus is the only begotten Son of God. Isaac carried the wood for his own sacrifice up the mountain, and Jesus carried his wooden cross up the hill of Calvary. And just as Isaac had the physical strength to escape, but chose to submit to Abraham, Jesus had the power to call down legions of angels and save himself, but still chose the cross. We can even look at the Jewish tradition of the Akedah. Both were bound voluntarily. Isaac allowed cords to be wrapped around his wrists, and Jesus stood before Pilate and Roman soldiers, facing their accusations and refusing to defend himself. Both were bound to wood. Isaac was laid on top of the firewood his father had prepared, bound tightly. Jesus was stretched out and nailed to the wooden beam of the cross. Isaac's bindings were temporary. The ropes were cut, and Isaac walked off the mountain. Jesus' bindings lasted a little longer, 3 days, until the sacrifice was finished and death was defeated forever. Sometimes God calls us to be Abraham, to initiate, to drive forward, to act boldly in faith. But sometimes God calls us to be Isaac. He calls us to lay down our strength, our control, our right to fight back in a situation, and simply trust the Father's will. I'd be willing to argue that kind of faith, the faith to submit, that was demonstrated perfectly by Jesus, shows the greatest strength of all. I know there are some people out there who are facing medical diagnoses. They're facing financial hardships. They're facing these situations where God isn't calling you to act in faith. He's calling you to submit in faith. What's going on in your life? To just walk in it, silently trusting that God's plans are greater than our plans. And I hope if that's you today, that these stories of Isaac and ultimately Jesus on the cross, the faith of submission, the faith to put our strength aside and just trust that God has a plan. I pray that these stories have encouraged you today to know that you're not alone. And for some of you watching, God's asking you to take a step of faith, to step out, maybe into a new career field, maybe to step out and serve in the local church, to do something out of your comfort zone that you're being called to do. Which faith is God asking you to walk in today? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with someone who might need it today. I'll see you in the next video. God bless.